Benvinguts novament a tots. Moment ara per escoltar a D Adamson, o Kate, com la coneixem aquí a Acció. Ella és una veritable visionària, és una de les principals futuristes i ecocentristes mundials i es defineix a si mateixa com una escèptica esperançada. És una autoritat global sobre com podem crear valor sostenible en el futur i el seu pensament guia i influeix líders i organitzacions arreu del món. Avui ella és aquí per desafiar les nostres suposicions sobre absolutament tot, des de la geopolítica, la societat i el medi ambient, fins a l'economia, la tecnologia o fins i tot el mateix concepte de negoci. Coneguda per la seva rapidesa i franquesa, les seves intervencions han estat descrites com una xerrada TED amb esteroides o una pel·lícula de Tarantino on ningú mor. Kate, welcome. Thank you very much for your presence. It is an honor to have you here today, and we are really looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Right, okay, I'm going to try something here that I don't usually do. I'm going to try and address you properly and say bon dia. Gracias por permettre me parler d'anglais. Did I get that right? Wonderful. I appreciate it, because if you'd asked me to speak in the beautiful Catalan language, this would have gone on all afternoon. So you've made a wise choice. So listen, I imagine when you heard that a futurist was going to come and speak to you, you assumed it would involve algorithms, correct? Yeah, great. Well, I'd hate to disappoint you. So here's one that I prepared earlier. Yes, this is an algorithm. And actually, it may be the world's first algorithm, and it's around 3,500 years old. What you're looking at here, my friends, is a Babylonian star chart, and it contains an intercalary algorithm. What's one of those? Well, an intercalary algorithm basically syncs up our lunisolar calendar with the seasons or the moon phases by using leap days, weeks, months, years. And that represented a really profound breakthrough, because for the first time in human history, we could standardize and we could control time. And in fact, right now, today, our 60-second minute, 60-minute hour, that is still based on the Babylonian sexagesimal base 60 number system. So lunisolar movements, they have always determined the rhythms of our lives and the lives of other species here on Earth. But Babylonian astronomical observations suddenly created this explosion of new data. This gave us the ability to measure, to anticipate, to predict, and that taken together created certainty. And that absolutely revolutionized both government and business. So we had brand new innovations like contracts, debt interest, investments, joint stock companies, even cross-border trade and logistics. And actually, Mesopotamian business was remarkably sophisticated. And if you want to know just how sophisticated, this is where you need to go. This is room 56 in London in the British Museum. And they have a whole range of artifacts from the Mesopotamian era. But there's one in particular that tells a great story. You may recognize it, actually. It's this. I don't know if anybody recognizes it. It may well be the world's oldest customer complaint. And it was written by a guy called Nani to a merchant called Nazir of Ur. And he's complaining that he ordered copper from him, that the copper he delivered was not of a proper grade, that it was late. And when he sent his servant to complain, he was rude to his servant, and then he refused to give him a refund. And if you look at the transcript of this, it's so painfully modern, It became an internet meme. And I thought I would share a couple of my favorite internet memes with you. This on the left, Nazir, scam lightly. On the right, I love this one, receives wrong copper, angrily chisels note for 6 hours. How angry do you have to be, right? Any Pirates of the Caribbean fans in the room? You are without doubt the worst Mesopotamian copper merchant I've ever heard of, but you have heard of me. Yeah? This one I love. So this is Nazir, and he's got the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. And the devil's saying, "Go ahead, Short-change nanny on that copper. He won't even notice, bro. You will definitely not be remembered for this for thousands of years. And the angel's going, you wouldn't believe me if I told you, really, you know. But my ultimate favorite, this is my definite favorite, Trump picks copper merchant Ian Azir as Secretary of State for metallurgy. Controversial Sumerian tapped for powerful position in US government. Can't beat that. But the reality is that actually Trump's return does mark another watershed moment for business and for government. You know, the end of the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal free trading and security guarantees that we've been used to for nearly a century. And of course, it's another explosion of algorithms and of data. You know, AI promises to transform the world and its economy. PwC reckon it could boost GDP globally by 15% by 2035, driving unprecedented productivity and wealth creation, and of course, fundamentally reshaping business. And let's be fair, folks, we're hanging on by our fingertips right now as it is. Am I right? Yeah? How about this from McKinsey? There are no signs of a leveling off. If anything, the frequency of organizational upheavals is increasing. Harvard professor says these are revolutionary attempts to transform organizations. Most have a structure that was designed to solve problems that no longer exist. Man has a limited biological capacity for change. Sound familiar? Well, I imagine it probably does, but actually all these quotes are taken from a book that was published 55 years ago this year. A book by Alvin Toffler, the futurist, called Future Shock. So you see, we've been here before. This is a future originally envisioned in the 1940s that really came of age in the 1960s. You know, the first chatbot were called chatterbots back in the day. It arrived in 1966. It's called Eliza. It's just come back online. You can go and play with it. It's remarkably sophisticated. But Toffler, and here with his wife Heidi, they saw the future as imagined by US corporate science and technology in the sort of late 1960s, and they believed that it would overwhelm humanity. In fact, they believed by 1970 we were already suffering these symptoms of future shock. In fact, it was Toffler who came up with the phrase information overload. And of course, he was right in that respect, right? Because we are going to create, capture, copy, and consume more business-to-consumer data in the next 3 years than we did in the last 30. This year, that could rise to 181 zettabytes. 1 zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes, by the way. But here's the interesting thing about data, is the word data, where it comes from. It comes from the Latin datum. It means that which is given, the truth. But of course, it's not the truth, is it? Because as we all know, data is being tortured and weaponized on a truly industrial scale now all around the world. And a lot of that is because we've got a data arms race, and it's really fueled by technology. But big tech, they don't want to stop that. They want to supercharge it. And they are taking full advantage of this new free speech era, you know, in this post-content moderation world, because their mission is different. Their mission is to unleash AI from human constraints so it can achieve its full potential. Because according to them, Moore's law plus this tsunami of data means that superintelligent AI is pretty much inevitable now. So we're going to move from where we are today, the modern age, to the Technozoic age. This technological singularity, the point at which we're out-evolved by our own technology, is rushing towards us. You know, it will finally breach human limits, our capacity to actually control and to direct our own future. But there's a bit of a wrinkle in that, because the populism that's breaking out all over the world is actually about taking back control. And yes, it's, you know, fueled by anger about culture and gender and secularization, but also about technology, about globalized trade, automation, the kind of labor market shocks that destabilized and destroyed communities around the world and their economic prospects and their expectations. Because populists are not hyper-rational technocrats. They are moral crusaders. And they're taking advantage of the dawning of what I call our new moral age. They are capitalizing on this really interesting shift from the Homo economicus we always thought human beings were to something new, Homo empathicus. Everywhere you look, people seem increasingly willing to make all sorts of economic sacrifices for what they consider to be a strong moral cause, whether that's the environment or sovereignty or biodiversity, and not just at an individual level, increasingly at a national level and a geopolitical level too. And you see, Homo empathicus is destabilizing the system. Because once we as individuals begin to prioritize subjective things like, moral or cultural or ethical beliefs over our utility maximization, our world order begins to melt away. And there's, people are rejecting these traditional economic, political, spending and investment priorities. They're making what we have historically considered to be irrational choices. And I'll tell you what, there's zero tolerance as well, Homo empathicus, hence the rise of the boycott, right? From go woke, go broke to Tesla. Boycotts aren't new, but this does seem to be different. It seems to be tapping into a deeper anger amongst consumers and investors. And I think that honestly is because money, markets, finance, they've been our global priority, and our world and its data reflects that. I mean, in many respects, corporate and financial values have become de facto human values. We even talk about ourselves as human capital. We have to constantly tend to our own present and future value. And the same year that Future Shock was written, Milton Friedman famously said that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profit. The high watermark of that was probably Gordon Gekko. And if any of you are old enough to remember Wall Street and Gordon Gekko, remember when greed was good? Well, greed was good, but increasingly today now, creed is good. And that is a massive problem for business because we have encouraged businesses to de-emphasize things like geography and identity, culture and ideology. We have granted business neutrality in pursuit of its profit. But that's coming to an end because a seismic realignment is underway. And if you want evidence of that, listen to former Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who said freedom is more important than free trade. The protection of our values is more important than profit. Rather than globalized free markets, the world is beginning to reallocate itself into independent groups and spheres of interest. Neoliberalism that we've had for at least the last 30 or 40 years is giving way to something new, but something oddly familiar. It's kind of mercantilism of the 18th century, but it's kind of on steroids, a meta-mercantilism, if you like, more similar to what's been going on in China in recent decades, protectionist, expansionist, interventionist. And that means we're witnessing a titanic struggle. Because what's actually happening is that states around the world are struggling to try and reassert their power over businesses, markets, and particularly the borderless, dematerialized global corporations that we've created. What's really going on is that all around the world, value is being recalibrated. And that means relationships are being remade. So the future is going to be determined by a whole bunch of things that begin with the letter D. Demographics, digitalization, deglobalization, decarbonization, doctrine, debt, and defense. Because make no mistake, the commercial peace that we've enjoyed for the last 80 years is over. Secretary General Rutte last year said we should adopt a wartime mindset. Actually, I'm going to go further. I'm going to tell you we're already at war. It's just that war looks different than it used to. The greatest danger that any business in this or indeed any other room faces is currently cyber attack. Consumers and businesses are consistently the targets of nation-state-sponsored cyber attacks. ChatGPT drove a nearly 1,300% rise in phishing email attacks. Cybercrime this year could cost the world globally about $10.5 trillion US. That's how big this problem is. But it doesn't even have to be malicious. I don't know if any of you have seen this cartoon before. I rather like this. So there's all modern digital infrastructure, and then all standing on this little pillar at the bottom, which is a project some random dude in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. Yeah? The reality is, at the source code level, at the machine language level, somebody rage quitting somewhere can actually break the internet, and it has happened. So what this really highlights is a much, much deeper danger, one I talk a lot about, which is concentration of dependence. Now, I can explain that and sum it up for you in one word, and that one word is CrowdStrike. Remember CrowdStrike? Remember when they decided to do an update and took half the world offline? Well, as I told the BBC at the time, what this exposes is our concentration of dependence on invisible infrastructure. Take the cloud market. 70% of the cloud market is controlled by just 4 players, more than 30% of that by Amazon. If you look at office productivity, look at the United States, 85% of the public sector's office productivity software is actually provided by Microsoft. Look at global trade, all those big ships out deep sea, almost all of them rely on the Inmarsat constellation. You take that out, every single ship and its cargo is uninsured. And we do have to look up, because it's no good just talking about geopolitics anymore. We have to talk about astropolitics, because power and politics is interplanetary. Satellites are a crucial element of warfare and defense early warning systems. But of course, they're also critical to our daily lives, to mobility, to travel and logistics and trade, which to me makes it all the more astonishing we got into the position that we did. But nation states are making a course correction. They've recognized that the risks of ceding control of space-based assets to any private company is really not a good idea, and unfortunately not even to traditional allies now. You probably heard earlier in the year that President Trump decided to cease data sharing with Ukraine in its defense of its homeland. You probably assumed that was military data, right? But it wasn't. That was a private data contract with Maxar. So the president ordered a private company to suspend a commercial data contract. Now, we've been told for decades that when we do business in China, we're ultimately doing business with the Chinese Communist Party. But what Trump really proved there was that the US and China are no different, and indeed, no state is any different. Now, ultimately, the power to switch these things off lies with governments. And when you think that global business, trade, logistics, as I say, all these things depend on, Starlink, GPS, these are American systems, all US companies. And the president, this one or a subsequent one, could easily choose to switch them off, to restrict usage, to stop data sharing with companies or countries or vessel or aircraft, which is why technology and digital investments that have just been a great gold rush up until now are becoming an emerging risk. It's no longer good enough for things to be efficient and cost-effective. Whether you're talking about AI or software or platforms, this now has to be geostrategically aligned. It has to be resilient, has to be sustainable. Digital sovereignty is becoming a priority. If that's not a phrase you've heard before, listen out for it, because you're going to hear more and more of it. And this is the reason why, because corporations are becoming the instruments of nation states again. And that means it's the end for these apolitical, neutral, borderless, digital, dematerialized corporations. Dematerialization has been such a watchword, hasn't it? But no longer. The new watchword is rematerialization. My friends, meat space. Meat space is back, and it's back in a big way. Because digitalization didn't dematerialize anything. It always depended on big chunks of physical infrastructure in meat space. So, this asset-light, everything as a service, digitalization, that worked for neoliberal free trading. But today, where assets are owned, where they're built, where they're located, where they're financed, it's now about much more than cost. Because as instruments of governments, corporations around the world are finding their infrastructure, their networks, and their assets increasingly politicized and increasingly weaponized. And, of course, all of this is happening, the world getting so much more dangerous, just as multilateralism begins to stumble. The end of the Bretton Woods consensus is signaling fragmentation into governance spheres as well. So, between proxy conflicts and sanctions and tariffs, for companies trying to, trade and manage complex supply chains, it's going to be an increasing struggle to do that under global compliance. So ultimately, the age of optimization is over. Because optimization, by definition, it reduces resilience, it reduces adaptability, because it assumes a degree of certainty about the circumstances that we're optimizing for. And that's fine when everybody's playing nicely with each other. But today, in our increasingly dangerous and volatile multipolar world, that certainty is increasingly illusory. So the age of optimization is over, and the age of resilience has begun. And resilience casts a really long shadow, because the reality is, my friends, that resilience and adaptability is expensive, it's complex, it's inefficient, and it's reshaping the foundations of global business. So the three pillars of the global consumer economy are shifting. Limited liability is becoming collaborative responsibility. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is becoming caveat venditor, let the seller beware. And planned obsolescence is becoming virtual stewardship of valuable resources and materials. And these shifts taken together, they could represent an existential threat for some of the world's most valuable brands and companies. So decarbonisation, important though it is, really is just the beginning. Because up until now, we've allowed organisations of all kinds to socialise their externalities, the phrase that economists use to describe the cost to people and planet of companies creating their profit. Now, we're increasingly saying you've got to quantify these externalities and you've got to start pricing them into your products and your services. And, that's a real problem, because today the world's biggest industries burn for about $7.5 trillion worth of free natural capital. More than half the profits of the world's largest companies would be at risk if we chose to price water to reflect its true value. Now, the World Bank reckons that biodiversity loss could cost the global economy nearly $3 trillion by 2030. And that's why major companies and institutions are soon going to have to monitor and disclose their biodiversity-related risks. But here's the thing. Every ton of CO2 is identical. Every square foot of nature is completely unique. So this creates magnitudes more complexity than we ever had to deal with before. And in fact, to be honest, these expectations are increasingly incompatible with our traditional business practices. We talk, don't we, about the climate crisis signalling ecosystem breakdown. And I think when we hear that phrase, we immediately think about plants and animals. But the reality is that our human, civilizational, capitalist ecosystems are built on top of those natural ones, which is why the former head of Allianz earlier this year said insurers will no longer be able to offer cover for many climate risks, which makes many other financial services unviable, from mortgages to investments. You see, we didn't think this stuff mattered. And priorities and beliefs and assumptions drive our data. And by choosing to measure and quantify certain things and not others, what we've actually done is we've created a skewed and an unsustainable value system. It's how we've ended up with Amazon, the company worth trillions, when the Amazon, the most important ecosystem on the planet, is worth nothing until it's chopped down, burnt, or sold. It's how Goldman Sachs can warn their biotech clients that curing patients may not be a sustainable business model. It's how the head of Microsoft can go hell for leather for AI, even though he claims it may be the last technology that humanity ever invents. It's how you can get a chilled Coca-Cola pretty much anywhere on the planet, but we still struggle to get a chilled vaccine from a factory into a child's arm. How did we get here? We got here because business lost sight of its roots and of its purpose. The severing of the bond between social purpose and value and the corporation is actually very recent. Only in the last 150, 200 years. Before that, for pretty much 3,000 years, incorporation, becoming a corporation, that was a restricted privilege. It was only granted in return for societal or national state value that went beyond taxable profit. Ethical concerns dominated commercial thinking for most of human history, and now we're beginning to re-establish that bond. And that has huge implications for the modern corporation. It means, to use startup language, that the modern corporation was a great startup, but it is not going to scale. So it has to do what all good startups do. And indeed, we heard it earlier, we have to pivot. And pivot stands for the key areas of focus: purpose, interdependence, value and values, openness and trust, because believe me, trust really is the new gold. And where do we pivot towards? Where will future sustainable value be created? Well, I believe it'll be created here at what I call the new value nexus. It is where the green economy, the blue economy, and the circular economy come together. And ESG and this new moral age are acting as accelerators. And if you want to capture value at the new value nexus, it demands completely new data and metrics. But more than that, it means remaking our traditional attitudes towards business, towards investment, and towards our organizations. What's required is a sustainable transformation of business. I believe it's becoming a cultural and a commercial imperative. And this transformation demands 4 key competencies: ESG, data and digital, enterprise and value chain agility, and purpose-led business. And here's the thing about sustainable transformation. It's a team sport. You can't really win it. And that demands a cultural shift from the zero-sum game that we're used to a hero-sum game, if you like. Because what heroes understand is that sometimes you may have to give up just a little in order for everybody to win. And culture really does eat everything, for breakfast, lunch, dinner, supper, and a naughty little snack from the fridge before bedtime. I do it, you do it, we all do it, right? It eats strategy, it eats technology, and it eats innovation, because I imagine you think that innovation around the world is going gangbusters, yeah? From all the stuff we read? Well, it's not. Innovation around the world is tanking. Science papers and patents are becoming less disruptive and radical. Research productivity is declining in everything from pharmaceuticals to semiconductors. Why? Well, I think because we have a toxic innovation culture. It's like Fight Club. The first rule of innovation is, we do not talk about innovation, right? It's all about beating the other guy. You keep it quiet, and then you come out and beat everybody else, yeah? Disruptive innovation, and this is really important because we've been talking about this for decades, disruptive innovation has really focused on minimizing your accountability, your liability, and your responsibility. In technology, disruptive innovation has meant breaking the rules on the basis that because you're a technology company, they don't apply to you, right? Well, here's the thing. Breaking the rules is easy. Remaking the rules is far, far harder, and that's the task that we have ahead of us now. You know, accountability has been a really dirty word in business for a long time now, but I'm here to tell you that accountability is opportunity. And here's the thing, accountability is contagious. Because the more accountable you become, the more accountable you force others in your value chain to become as well. And this is a historic move that's happening now. We are moving from the value chains of the past to the values chains of the future. Real, true disruptors now, they're embracing this idea of radical accountability. These are the renegades that are going to reshape global ecosystems all around us, making new rules. So I'd really like us to stop talking about disruptive innovation because it is fundamentally unsuited to driving the kind of systemic change that we need. What we really want in future is integrative invention. And that means reframing our relationships and our mindsets from customers and suppliers that are selling products and services and investors that are seeking alpha to ecosystems and values change that work together to achieve these common goals. You know, sustainable shared value, security, resilience. It's about a leadership paradigm shift from egocentric to ecocentric, from command and control to convene and catalyze. What we really want to be doing is orchestrating resilient, adaptable, secure ecosystems that have experience at their heart, because experience now really is everything. You know, people demand these hyper-personalized, tailored experiences that are sensitive to their individual needs, their values, and their beliefs, and not just as our customers. Our wider stakeholders, our employees are demanding these. And we have to find some way to deliver these authentically and also at scale. And if we're not, we're leaving money on the table. Businesses today are capturing a fraction of the value that they could. Experience-led growth is huge opportunity, but in order to capture it, you have to meet a quite significant challenge. You have to be agile in terms of your operating model, your value chain, and indeed your enterprise. So what does that really look like? What do we mean by agility? Well, for me, agility means creating the environment, the capability and the culture that really motivates people in the organization to continuously, to autonomously and dynamically respond, both to value-creating opportunities and also to enterprise risk as well. And at the heart of that, and I've heard it so many times today, is multidisciplinary, cross-functional, cognitively diverse teams, where authority to do stuff is following the problem that you're trying to solve rather than the hierarchy of the organization. Now, I think actually at its heart, agility really means people defining the system rather than being defined by it. Because when you think about it, up until now at work and across our societies, we've prioritized systems over people. And then we've adopted technology to reinforce those systems, often at the expense of individuals. And this picture kind of says it all for me. This, my friends, is what happens when the legal department wins an argument with the marketing department. We've all been there, haven't we? Carnegie Mellon University did some work a few years ago. They found it would take 76 days, reading 8 hours a day to get through all the legal paperwork that you and I are shown online in the average year. Isn't that incredible? Is it any wonder people feel helpless? Huh? And not just at home, but also at work, because our traditional culture of command and control management, that's worked hand in hand with technology. It's steadily removed people's autonomy, locked them down ever more tightly. And now, apparently, it's going to remove us all together because, sentient AI, yay, sentient AI is coming, yeah. Okay, can we please stop drinking the big future Kool-Aid, okay? Let's just not do that. Everyone in Silicon Valley knows this is nonsense. The reality is, impressive though it is, ChatGPT is basically a pimped-out autocorrect with a multi-billion-dollar PR campaign that has been taught to lie convincingly. That's all it is, right? But we still have all these people convinced that they've found conscious entities in AI. And actually, they're right, People who believe they've found sentience in AI are correct, but not the sentience you think. Because actually the secret scandal of AI is that most of it isn't technology at all. It depends on millions of invisible cloud workers behind the scenes. And as the Fair Work Project said, these mostly invisible laborers, mostly in the global south, poorly paid even by local standards and with no labor rights at all. You see, meat space never left. And meat bags aren't going anywhere either. Because you probably heard at the beginning of the year, all these companies are replacing all these humans. Oh, well, surprise, surprise, they're hiring them all back. And this quote from the CEO of Klarna, I couldn't believe this when I read this. We just had an epiphany, he says. In a world of AI, nothing is going to be as valuable as humans. So we're going to become the best at offering a human to speak to. Dear God. Really, dear God, I know we've got chatbot Jesus now, okay, but AI is not the holy grail. It's not a panacea, it's a tool. And it doesn't matter how much has been invested in it. Every tool has its limitations, and we're beginning to understand those limitations now. But here's the most important limitation of AI. During the pandemic, we had to switch off a lot of AI systems, and it's happening again quite a lot now, for quite a simple reason. Because AI uses the past to predict the future. Now, in certain scenarios, in certain use cases, that is unbelievably useful, and we must use it. But in uncertain conditions, the priority is no longer to predict. The priority becomes to adapt. And that, my friends, that's what we do. That's what humans do. Because when I look out at you, I'm looking at 4 billion years of R&D with unlimited budget. The potential in people is huge. And yet, as businesses, we're racing to produce these trusted and autonomous systems when the vast majority of people in our societies and in our workplaces really are neither of those things. This is Wernher von Braun. He's known as the father of space travel in the US. He had a view on this, which I'd like to share with you. He said, the best computer is a man, and it's the only one that can be mass-produced by unskilled labor. Kind of hard to argue with that, isn't it? But here's the issue. Investing in people is uncompetitive. It's nowhere near as tax efficient or as profitable as investing in technology or assets or robots. I know we talk a lot about technological unemployment. Technological unemployment happens because we subsidize capital and we tax labor, right? That isn't an inevitability. That is a choice. And it's a choice that we can make differently. We can choose to become purpose-driven, people-led, and technology-enabled in that order. But that demands a cultural transformation, one that prioritizes people and outcomes over systems and technology. And in order to do that, data is table stakes. You know, we have to use data, reimagine data and metrics. You know, we can't use it to embed historical assumptions and inequities to perpetuate these failing systems around us. We need to use it to challenge assumptions, to change things for the better. Because here's something interesting. You know that global data sphere I mentioned earlier, that 181 zettabytes? Well, it turns out that actually the growth of the global data sphere is driven by the data that we consume and analyze, not the data that we create. You with me? So the recursion rate of data, the rate at which the same data is processed again, that is rising exponentially. But it's driving new data right the way down to only about 10% of the total. Now just pause for a moment and reflect on how profoundly we could change the world if that ratio was reversed. And we actually do have an unprecedented opportunity to change the world, because what comes next is not this technological singularity, it's a liminality. It comes from the Latin limes. It means a pause, a gap in between, a threshold of the future where the old certainties have been dismantled, but what's going to replace them is still very unclear. And during liminal periods, individuals and organizations have outsized opportunities to create truly meaningful change. But here's the thing that we all conveniently forget about change. Change means exchange. We just shorten it. You have to give something up before you can get something new. That's why change is so hard. And business has a huge change ahead of it. You know, it has to adapt, it has to reinvent, it has to transform itself, not for the 21st century, but for the 22nd century. A profound reorientation is needed. We have to recalibrate value, redefine innovation, reframe economics, rediscover leadership, reboot digital, and we have to reimagine competition. You know, competition, the word comes from the Latin competere. It means to strive together. The word company comes from the Latin compane. It means to share bread. You see, my friends, we have to remember what companies are for. For most of human history, incorporation was a privilege and not a right. Social purpose and mutual aid are founding principles of business, and nowhere is that more relevant than where we stand today in this magnificent Roman remains around us here in Tarragona, because we recognize the Roman influence, but actually before the Romans, it was the Phoenicians, quite a not very well known. But they emerged from the Bronze Age collapse, which created chaos around us, to found powerful cities and trading settlements, including here. And the interesting thing about the Phoenicians is that their power came from commerce, right? Not like the Romans, you know, it wasn't conquest and conflict. They used their pragmatism, their gift for trade, and they pretty much rebuilt civilization, you know, on the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean and in the Near East. And I believe that remains in the cultural DNA here. I really do. You know, your heritage of openness and business acumen, collaborative solidarity. I think that is how you've built a commercial and industrial powerhouse here. And it makes complete sense to me that you will be pioneers in clustering and hybridization. When I was researching to come and speak to you, I came across this quote, and I wanted to share it with you because I love it. And the chap was saying, Catalans live their lives between two fundamental concepts that are very hard to translate. And he had me there. I love that. The fact that it's hard to translate, I love, right? Now, let me get this right. La Rausha and El Sen. Okay, I'm on fire today. And I love this. The balance makes us practical yet creative, organized yet passionate, innovative and yet pragmatic. And that speaks to me. When I look at the culture here, the Castell, I think they embody everything I've just been talking to you about. Ecosystem thinking, integrative invention, resilience, adaptability. So I think when we talk about creating the foundations of the hybrid future, it's that wonderful phrase, for piña, right? That's right, because like the piña, the foundations of the hybrid future are built on breadth, on balance, on courage, and on diversity. I love the fact that anyone can join the piña, right? You don't have to be an expert. I love that idea. I love the idea that rival teams will come and join in, to help when there's a really complex tower being built. And this speaks to me about the truth that we should take away, that great ideas can come from anywhere, and our greatest strength comes from shared purpose. It's interesting, actually, when you look at it, the closest that we've ever come as humans to shared values is trade. And that's why millennia later, euthanasia is still considered a norm violation. We wouldn't recognize much about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, but we all know we don't want to do business with euthanasia, right? But actually, I think people are concerned that the connection between business and societal value creation has been strained to its breaking point. People are becoming concerned that instead of a norm violation, euthanasia is becoming more of the norm. And we've heard a lot recently about bosses reclaiming their business culture, the return of the 60-hour work week and all of this. But we have to keep in mind, when we talk about business culture, we're talking about US culture. US business culture has dominated. And the world has optimized for this extractive, profit-driven corporate culture. But the reality is, I think we're all beginning to realize that the next century is not going to be an American century. And that's important because being competitive in the next iteration will be about diverse hybrid ecosystems of stakeholders, of species, and of organizations, and not this rigid focus on the corporation. There are different kinds of organization. Inclusive, democratic business models like cooperatives, non-profits, the kind of business models that America doesn't really like very much, but the rest of the world, particularly Europe, understands. Here in Catalonia and in the Basque Country, huge tradition of cooperatives still really embedded and important in the business community. We need to reconnect with our business culture and wisdom, our local business culture and wisdom. And I think there's a particular piece of wisdom that's very useful for you here in Catalonia. And I was told that the Castell are really important. Everywhere the tourists, it's been built, but actually it's not really finished until you've dismantled it too, right? That's incredibly important. Knowing how to safely dismantle something is as important as knowing how to build it in the first place. And to be honest, I think that is essential wisdom as we all navigate our way through a system which seems to be on the verge of collapse. I believe, actually, that fairness, honesty, trusted professionalism, they have always held the power to bridge the kind of cultural, political, and religious divides that we see opening up around us all the time. They are the foundation on which we can begin to imagine a better future, because machines can use the past to predict the future, but they can't imagine a different one. As the Pax Americana collapses, the future is genuinely open. And the future isn't somewhere that we go. It's ours to create. But in order to do that, we have to be bold. We have to take the odd risk. Qui no arrisca no pisca, right? Am I right? Yeah. But wherever I go all over the world, I'm told that we're heading for a future that nobody seems to want, but everybody feels helpless to influence. We seem to have lost confidence in our capacity to act in the world. You know, and I blame this guy. I blame Toffler and his limited biological capacity for change, right? It's nonsense. And I'm going to prove it to you right now. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to Mrs. Webb and Mrs. Williams. They are my grandmothers, or they were. And they were both born in 1912, okay? So that means that these women, they lived through the disappearance of the horse and carriage, the introduction of running water, mass sanitation, mass suffrage, 2 world wars, the discovery of antibiotics, the invention of the nuclear bomb, the microchip, the jumbo jet, mass air travel, the contraceptive pill, television, and they both watched the first steps of man on the moon. And they were still only 57 years old. Connie and Agnes coped. I think we can too. Yeah, I really do. Because we created all of this. Like we created the calendar and the corporation. And my friends, we are not done yet. We can make data great again. We can make business great again. In fact, we can make the future great again. Because when you actually analyze it, scientists reckon that we make an average of about 50 significant choices a day as individuals. So if you think there's 8 billion people on the planet, that means the future is actually this dynamic, emergent amalgam of about 400 billion daily decisions, which is fabulous when you think about it. But it also means something else. It also means that every single day you have 50 opportunities to change the future. And you know, I believe that between small acts of defiance and informed choices and the courage to actually live the values that we really care about, we do hold the power to shape this world that's in flux around us. We can rescue our collective future, and we can make it great again, and we can do it for everyone. Because I did speak a lot today about systemic change, but systemic change starts with us, because we are the system. So the thought I leave you with is, why not make just one of those 50 choices differently? And why not start today? It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor speaking to you. Gracias. Thank you very much indeed.
Many thanks, D Adamson, for such an inspiring speech. Now we will see on the screen some questions raised by the audience, so you may answer them. Poden fer preguntes mitjançant aquest codi QR a la nostra ponent i ella les anirà responent. Let's go.
Okay, how do we create that cultural transformation that prioritizes people and outcomes? I think if we look at this from a business perspective, a lot of this is about leadership, because we exist, most of us, in very hierarchical organizations, and I think prioritizing purpose, is quite a challenging thing to do. But having said that, I think what all of this comes down to is metrics, and that you may be surprised to hear me say that. But we live in a world right now where everything is data, everything is about, profit and loss, EBITDA, and the only way that you start building purpose-driven business, building this in to what's important, is by capturing it and using metrics. In actual fact, there are already a lot of metrics around that. Sustainable business metrics, I think they are, of the IBC, the International Business Council, from the World Economic Forum, going back sort of 5 or 6 years now. They have a whole range of metrics. I think it's 21 core metrics and 34 expanded ones that literally capture all of this around purpose, around sustainability, environmental, all those things. And the idea is that you report these non-financial metrics in the same way that you report your financial metrics. So if you are a business leader or an owner, or if you're an entrepreneur indeed, then that's, I would suggest, the first place to look. Because once you start reporting these metrics, you encourage the rest of your value chain to do the same. So a very, very practical answer to that is to start with metrics and where you can find them. And I'm quite sure all the ASIO people will put you in touch with anything you need to find those kind of metrics.
Second question.
Yeah, more detail about how the future could be more about values than about technology itself. I think we all inherently understand that the future has to be about values, but I don't think we've really been given the opportunity to develop technology that's aligned with our values. And I think part of that, at least, is down to the F word. Relax, it's not that F word. It's okay. Breathe, it's okay. The F word I'm talking about is free. Because an awful lot of the technology that you use day to day, you don't pay for. There was some research done a few years ago. They reckoned if you add together, your navigation maps, your social media, all these bits and pieces, your email bits and pieces, that the value of that to the average US citizen anyway was about $30,000 a year. That's what you'd actually have to pay to use all of these systems that we just used. So the way that I approach this is to actually make a choice about whether you would pay for something. And indeed, if you value something, pay for it. I mean, I use Wikipedia a lot, so I pay for it. I don't use stuff, and I don't pay for it. And this is particularly important when it comes to things like AI, when it comes to social media, because when things are just available, we just consume them. And it's up to us to an extent. I mean, there's responsibilities on all sides, but we can start with us by saying, am I using this because it's free? Am I using it because I get genuine value out of it? And if it is free, who is paying for it? Because as the old saying goes, if the product is free, you are the product. And increasingly, it's not just you, it's non-human species or the natural world, yeah? So these are the kind of questions that we need to have in our minds when we interrogate the kind of technology that we want to adopt. Because ultimately, if you said, no, you have to actually sell this stuff, you have to build in all the costs, and particularly when it comes to AI, the costs in terms of energy, in terms of water, when you actually saw this as a consumer, as an individual, as a business person, you could then make a genuinely informed choice about whether you wished to use that technology or not. And there are ways to switch this stuff off. You have to look hard for them. But every time Google comes up and says to you, would you like to use AI mode? There's a tiny little button at the bottom that says, no, press it. That's how we start making the future more about values than about technology.
And another question by the audience, for D Adamson.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I'm really cognizant of this. When we talk about values, but ultimately, when you go and see the bank manager, they don't want to know about your values, they want to know about your balance sheet. And I think this, and maybe this is a plant question because it couldn't have been more perfect, but this comes down to what we're here today talking about. It's about being part of ecosystems and about clusters where your values as part of a value chain and a cluster and an ecosystem are actually really valuable and relevant. Because you can de-risk all sorts of things as small companies when you come together. And I believe that the clusters that you have here, now they are the proto-ecosystems of the future. And I believe if you do want to genuinely have a value-driven business, then the hybrid model and the clusters couldn't be a better place for you to start. The number of businesses that I've heard about since I've been here for the last couple of days, they might be organic, they may be circular. These are the kind of ways that you can introduce these incredibly important developments. But as I say, you're not going out on your own as a small business, you're part of a larger ecosystem, trialing and moving forward. So, as I say, I don't know if that was a plant question, but if it was a really, really good one, because the answer to that is clusters, hybridization. I think that's where we go next.
Thank you very much for your presence.
Thank you.